All right, let's get started. So I'll share my screen because I'm the first person presenting. Just give me a moment. Can everyone see my screen? Thumbs up? Yeah, good. All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Everyone's welcome from different time zones. It's 4 a.m. here, so if you hear me say something silly, please bear with me. I've had 1 hour of sleep. So my name is Priyanka. Today I'm presenting the value of making data fair for infectious diseases, data management, and analytics. This is the first breakout BoF session of the Research Data Reliance Virtual Plenary 16. And with me today is Natalie Harrower and Mark Leggett. I should also mention that we are also the co-chairs of the RDA COVID-19 Working Group, and we'll be talking a bit about our work there as well. And before I proceed, I would first like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, and pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to extend my respects to any Indigenous or First Nations people present with us here today. So a few housekeeping. I think we're all quite aware of how Zoom works now, but you're all on mute, I guess. And please do mute your microphone if you're not speaking. We're not using Zoom webinar here, so you can interact with us using the chat function or use the raise hand function. Mark will be keeping an eye on the raise hand functionality while I'm presenting, and Natalie will be presenting after me. And I'll be introducing Natalie in a minute. So quickly setting the scene here, if you could type into the chat box, what is your expectation from this session? What dragged you here? What attracted you to this session? And what is the one thing that you're hoping to gain from the session? I'll give that a couple of minutes just to get an idea of what the expectation is. Sorry, I think I stopped sharing here. What happened? Yeah, all good. And I can't see the chat window while I'm presenting, so I'll just wait for people to post their comments and then have a look at it later. We are not big on numbers today, so we don't have a lot of people, so we're not going to use breakout rooms function. The workshop will be run as this one big room, Zoom room.
Someone's asking if it would be easier to type in the Google Doc. Or I can read out what comes into the chat if that helps, or?
Yeah, if you can, Natalie, please.
Sure. Well, so far there's nothing except that question. Okay.
Okay.
One person here to get an overview of the topic from Crystal. I'll say the names if they come up.
That's good. We're also aiming to keep it fairly broad and not dive into too many jargons and specifications about infectious diseases.
Well, Crystal, we're definitely going to do an overview. So
yes,
you're in the right room. Huajin is saying, look for opportunities to collaborate.
Excellent.
Rob is saying, as one of the authors of the FAIR principles, I thought it would be useful for me to bridge this health topic to the FAIR interest.
That's excellent. I think depending on how the workshop and the discussion goes, we'll know what the end goal would be, because right now we just want to see what the interest is and what the uptake is on this topic, because we're aware that the COVID-19 working group had an excellent uptake. A lot of people joined, a lot of people contributed, but as an infectious disease, as a broad topic, it'll be interesting to see what happens at the end of this BoF session. So we're quite keen to see how the session goes. All right, I think we've got a few responses here, so I will move on. Okay. So I'm Priyanka. My background is bioinformatics and computer programming. and I'm an academic specialist at the University of Melbourne. I work as a research data specialist for Melbourne Data Analytics Platform. We work on, we collaborate with researchers on data intensive projects around the university across multiple domains. And I also work as a health informatics specialist for the Australian Partnership for Preparedness Research on Infectious Disease Emergencies, based at the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity here at the University of Melbourne. I'll give a quick introduction and overview. So introduction to the session, what you can expect from this session, and an overview of the infectious diseases data ecosystem. So a bit of context, why we've put this session together and why it's important to address infectious diseases as a domain, and what's going on right now in terms of information and misinformation. So there's lots of papers, lots of content out there that highlights both the value of data as well as what misinformation and bad data is doing right now. And as we all know, I think this is the first time everyone in the world is thinking about one thing, which is the pandemic. So this is an interesting, not a quote, but this is an interesting content that I picked up from this paper. So by analyzing trends in COVID-19 data sets, the research community rapidly helped fill in knowledge gaps around disease symptoms, risk factors, racial disparities, and more. Such observational methods also hinted at which treatments seemed to be making an impact and which were not, all in near real time. This is from the paper Core Concept, The Pandemic is Prompting Widespread Use and Misuse of Real-World Data. Would highly recommend checking this out when you have time. So infectious diseases data as a broad concept, it has highlighted, so the ongoing pandemic has highlighted the importance of data-driven response. Public health and infectious diseases has always been a data-driven response, and it has been highly topical, but it's not been, it hasn't been a focal point beyond the pandemic. So people do focus, again, my understanding is a little bit narrow based here in Australia. Influenza gets a lot of importance, but infectious diseases and communicable diseases in general doesn't gather that much of, limelight, if I were to put it that way. But the pandemic has highlighted the importance of data-driven response. Now we also know how data drives decisions. We know what epidemiology is. Everyone's following the research that's going on. We understand what infectious disease modeling is. And all this has been around for quite some time, but only the pandemic has actually highlighted how these models, genomics data, lab data, clinical data, and all these different information systems feed into a response. Whether it's a peacetime response during routine research or peacetime, or whether it's during an epidemic or an outbreak. And it's important to think about infectious diseases data now because we want to be prepared for the next outbreak. Because as of now, in the current scenario, data has been the fuel or the oil that's driving the response. And we want to be prepared for the next one and have as much information as possible in hand before the next pandemic happens. So the contents for today's presentation, the workshop, is I'll give a quick introduction into the ecosystem of infectious disease data. And again, keeping it very, very broad, not going deep into what each data set means and how it's collected and what happens in different spheres of the ecosystem. Some reflections from the RDA COVID-19 working group, and Natalie would be sharing that. And then I'll come back and I'll talk a bit about the ongoing challenges, what an ideal infectious diseases data management and analytics platform would look like. And then we would get into a workshopping session where we'll ask people about their interest, what the domain area, what their domain area is, or if they are interested in a particular infectious diseases topic, what challenges they faced in terms of managing the data or running analytics on the data, and some strategies, resources, and ideas from people. And then we'll run a session on next steps. What this BoF forms into. Are we looking at an interest group, working group? Are we looking at a community of practice? And Mark will will speak to that. And this is a very simple overview. So there's different forms of information that feeds into the data ecosystem, the infectious disease data ecosystem. And I'm not even talking in the pandemic context here. This is even when when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. This is routine research, this is routine surveillance, and these are the main sort of information domains of blocks that feed into this ecosystem. So clinical data that comprises of EMR, medical records, clinical observational studies, trials data, and all forms of data coming out of clinical settings. Laboratory data, so genomics, diagnostics, tests, and other forms of diagnostical information, and even research on new diagnostics. So that's the laboratory information. Administrative data is information that's collected, how do I put it? So we're looking at information resources that are not directly related to health here. So administrative data could be your housing information, employment information. And as we all know, a pandemic or infectious diseases is not just a health problem. It actually affects every sphere of your life. So administrative data sets is all other forms of information that's collected on you and from a person. Community participation. So the information that people contribute, as people are the primary stakeholders of their data. It is their data and the information that people contribute to the ecosystem. Epidemiological and surveillance data, both routine and pandemic surveillance and epi data. And data collected on vulnerable and at-risk populations. There are populations who've been disadvantaged in previous pandemics, and also when there's ongoing infectious disease outbreaks. So the socioeconomic data and both the social and health indicators of populations. So that also feeds into the ecosystem. This is where my part ends. This is sort of the first, just an overview or introduction into the ecosystem. Next up is Natalie. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll introduce Natalie. So Natalie is the director of the Digital Repository of Ireland, a national infrastructure for HSS research data, a research center for best practice in digital archiving, digital preservation, open research, and FAIR data management. She was a member of the EC expert group that authored Turning FAIR into Reality, and is a member of the EOSC FAIR working group and serves on all European Academies ALIA's Open Science Task Force. Please welcome Natalie, who will give an overview of the RDA COVID-19 guidelines and how that has fed, it will serve as a template for us to follow. Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, Priyanka. Okay, let me try to share my screen and hope that I get the right screen. That's the one. Is it showing the proper full slide there?
Yes, Natalie, thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's see, so hi to everybody. I'm in Dublin where the sun is just setting, and it makes me sitting in the same desk where we worked on this COVID group through the spring for a number of weeks, and the sun didn't set for another 4 hours at that point. So we are definitely going into the darker part of the year, but it's nice to be back at one of these plenaries online. So what I'm going to do is give an overview of what the RDA COVID-19 working group did. And there are still activities ongoing. There's a meeting of this group during the plenary this week as well. And there are more outputs that keep emerging. Claire has actually posted some in the chat that there are some of the subgroups within this group have made their own groups and are working on things as well. So it's ongoing. But what I'm going to talk about is the output, what we created over this time period, and give an overview of that, because that should give some kind of idea of what a group like this one, this BoF, could do if it decides to turn into a working group or that kind of thing. So the first thing is that the working group was created at request of the European Commission. So the Commission came to the Research Data Alliance and asked us if we could put something like this together. And this was an unusual procedure. Usually they come from the sort of ground up. So this was different in this case. But RDA being a grassroots organization, people got involved very quickly as soon as they knew what the topic was. So we set the working group up with 4 different research areas, and then also 4 cross-cutting themes, because we realized that there were certain topics, as you'll see when I talk about them later, that really go across the different scientific research areas, and they needed to be addressed as such. We had lots of teams meeting at all hours because, you know, there were people like Mark, who's in Canada, me in Ireland, Priyanka, who's in Melbourne, and lots of the rest of you as well, trying to meet. Chairs, moderators, an editorial team, visualization team, a Zotero library team. Claire was in charge of that, and she's on this webinar as well. So from April 1st to June 30th, we had continual sprints. So the groups would work on their topics and create a new draft. Those drafts would be released openly for comment from the larger RDA community. And there'd be webinars to update everybody weekly about what was happening. And in the end, we went through 6 releases. And at the end of June, we came out with a final document, which is a hefty 143 pages long, but lots of excellent granular detail in there, as well as higher level recommendations. There is a 4-page executive summary. So this was a very exhilarating and unusual process, but I think really focused the minds of people in RDA during this pandemic as well. And there's lots of other outputs. You can go to a page called The Value of RDA for COVID-19, and you'll get that link when you get these slides later to see what else is happening. Okay, whoops. So that's the background to setting up the group. What really was the purpose of the group? What are the challenges that are being faced? And so why did this group have to come together? These should be obvious to a lot of us by now. In fact, I think Priyanka put it well. We all have a focus around the world on the pandemic, but I think this has also been a moment where the general kind of educated public has an awareness of the sharing of research and the sharing of data and the importance of that because of how we're operating globally. So there's a need to share this data, a critical need to share it quickly. But in terms of that being fast in how you do it, you also want to be precise to a certain level too. So there's a balance between those things. At the same time that we have this need, we don't have harmonized universal standards and context documents to share this data. There's no universally adopted system around it. So faced with the need to share it quickly, but accurately, not having the system, what can we do to try to bring different researchers and clinicians and policymakers together on this? What we essentially did is we had objectives, and I'll summarize these quite quickly here to say that there were 2 real main sides to the objectives. One was to create higher level recommendations that could be directed to governments and to funders, to infrastructure providers, policymakers, to look at the systemic ways that they could contribute to supporting better data sharing under COVID-19, because that's the goal of the document, better research data sharing about COVID-19. So that was one side of it. And then the other side was more granular guidelines that could be directed at researchers, at clinicians, at data stewards, and so on, to help them choose where their data would go, how it should be prepared, how to make sure that others can find it, okay, and use it, and all of the other aspects of FAIR. So those were the 2 sides to it: higher level recommendations on the one hand, and then more granular detailed guidelines on the other. And when you look at the document, you'll see that each group did things slightly differently because of the different remits, and that makes sense, but that was the overall way that it's structured. So hugely interdisciplinary effort to bring this kind of group together and to put these guidelines together. And that's part of, I think, what was so exciting about it. And I'll just very briefly, I'm not going to go into detail on these, but here are across the top, the 4 different research areas that we had groups on. So there was one on clinical data, one on omics. So that brings together genomics, proteomics, metabolomics. So looking at the functioning of the virus as well as its interaction with the host, epidemiology, and then also the social sciences, which was a sort of category bringing several other things together in terms of how we handle the virus and the responses to it, and research around those responses and their effectiveness from the social science perspective. And then we also had 4 groups that, as I mentioned before, were kind of cross-cutting or overarching. One of those was community groups. So how do, data that emerges from the public and the involvement of that, contact tracing apps, that sort of thing. Research software, very clear that if we're creating a lot of data, there's software behind the way that data is being put together and analyzed that is necessary for continuing to understand it and be able to work with it. So what do we need to do to make sure we share that? We also had a group on Indigenous data guidelines. and how data from Indigenous communities should be dealt with and how Indigenous communities should be involved in the processing of their data and other activities around the research to do with COVID-19. Again, I think this is one of the great benefits of having an interdisciplinary worldwide, an international community involved, thinking about more broadly of the different communities that are affected in different ways by COVID-19. And then the last one, but not least, was a legal and ethical considerations group that looked across everything that was happening in the document and in the working groups to be consistent in terms of advice around different guidelines and conventions to pay attention to, how licensing should be handled, consent, and that kind of thing. So just to dive in slightly deeper and give you a flash look at what the document appeared like, I'll show an example from the omics side. So this is from section 4.4.2, very well ordered, our document, guidelines for host genomics data. And then you can see here in this example that this is really, I have this kind of data, what repository should I put it in? What is the best place for metadata to be provided and contextual information to make sure that it's suitable and that others can find it. So this is the level of granularity you see in some of the guideline side of the document. And then if we look at, for example, the legal and ethical considerations, here's an example. And this is from a section on consent and the importance of gaining consent for data that is that's being collected at the time so that it can be used, but it can also be used down the chain again for other kinds of research that may be relevant. And you can see here just at the top, there's advice around consent in clinical situations, around data protection, around research environments. So this cross-cut through the different research areas. So I'm coming to the end here. What we did is we went through, the editorial team was kind of tasked with looking at what all of the different groups were doing and trying to cull from that some of the recommendations that appeared frequently. So instead of going to every section and reading that they say you should create FAIR data, which was the case across all the sections, we decided to pull some of those kind of higher level or overarching or common to the different groups guidelines into, or recommendations into, the first part of the document. So I won't go through all of these, but I will point out a few things that I think are important to the undertaking that Priyanka really is working on today with this BoF. One, the top thing that we noted, and I think this is really interesting because it doesn't always come up as first when we're talking about FAIR data, is the need to coordinate cross-jurisdictional efforts around global science, open science from a global perspective, to how do we take the work that we're doing, which may be very well developed in some cases or some domains in different jurisdictions, and make sure that those can talk to each other as well. And that is a really big task. There is a Global Open Research Commons group as well in RDA that is looking at some of these issues, but this came out very specifically in terms of the pandemic, because you can't get more global than the pandemic as an example around data sharing. So that's one thing to note. But then also we talked about having a data first policy. This is number 2 there. So get your data out there in a sense as soon as possible, and that needs to be incentivized. And that may be before the publication comes out, but with proper context, then people can assess how they may want to reuse that data. And then if you look at number 4, you'll see right there is the mention of the FAIR principles. Now the FAIR principles came up a lot. In fact, I would say if you look through the other recommendations that we have here at the high level, quite a few of them actually do relate to FAIR as well. So number 6 is about using generic and common, as well as domain-specific metadata standards and persistent identifiers. That folds right into FAIR perfectly. Number 7, documentation context. So not just sort of basic data, metadata, but make it as rich as possible and provide the other documentation when you can. The use of trustworthy data repositories that are committed to preservation and are robust is something that's also mentioned in the FAIR principles. Same goes for access being as open as possible, as close as necessary, and legal frameworks that promote the sharing of data across jurisdictions, 11 and 12. They're looking at things around licensing and openness and that sort of thing, which get discussed under the FAIR principles as well. So by focusing this BoF on infectious diseases and the model and FAIR, Priyanka's bringing together some of the really key elements that came out of this working group. And I should note there were over 600 people that signed up for this working group and got involved at various levels. In the end, the number of actual contributing authors was 160 and change, I think. So a lot of people involved in putting this together from all different kinds of disciplines. So I think it provides a very good starting point for seeing where we can go further on infectious diseases in general in a global context. And I don't think there's any better place for that than RDA, really, as all of you out there at various times of the day. Some of you probably cursing the hour that you have to be awake at will know very well. So this is my last page. You can find out more about the group by going to this one central page, the value of RDA for COVID-19. That's that first link that I put there. All the related outputs to do with the group are on that page. There's a direct link to the full recommendations and guidelines if you want to take a look through it. There are some tools that we're working on for navigating that as well, and there's some of those are already available on the page. Executive summary. And then very recently, as part of the Funders Forum, which took place last week as a pre-plenary event, a couple of the co-chairs on the working group, myself and Ingrid Dilo, put together specific recommendations to funders. And these are the kinds of outputs we're going to continue, things that address different audiences. And I think that's yes, I'm clicking and there's nothing more. So that is the end. I'll stop sharing and I will send it back to Priyanka.
Thanks, Natalie. It's a bit of a surreal moment because I had put together this abstract to focus on how we can make infectious diseases data fair and what it means for responses before the pandemic started, so for the last plenary, and then ended up working on the COVID-19 working group where everything was sort of real. It all became real and it was not just an abstract concept. And then we've actually seen the outputs. We've seen what impact that a collective community effort has when everyone is thinking about how to make data sharing better, how to make the best use of data, how to get the maximum research and information gain out of it. So that has been a truly rewarding experience. And thanks, Natalie, for presenting an excellent overview. So I'll bring things back a little bit to the broader infectious disease context and share my screen here. Can everyone see my screen? Yep.
Yes, it looks good. You're on slide 3.
Slide 3, excellent.
There's 3 there, yep.
So the next part is a platform. So the Infectious Diseases Data Management and Analytics Platform. Again, a very abstract concept, an acronym that I put together because I think in Australia, everyone loves to do that. So this is just trying to understand what an enabling platform. So a platform, ideal platform that would bring together different types of infectious diseases data, manage the data, and then that platform would enable the analytics and what that platform would look like. But before that, what are some of the challenges in infectious diseases data analytics and management? And these are some broad challenges, and they're not very different from what Natalie just highlighted from the RDA COVID-19 working group. But I think I'll try and give examples if I can, just to make it, again, I will have to talk about COVID because that's the most topical thing, but just in general, how these challenges actually impact the analytics and management. And then we would look at what an IDDMA platform should look like. So what are some of the biggest challenges, and not just COVID, but infectious disease data in general? So under data management, the biggest challenge is harmonization and standardization. So if I were to give an example here, the CT values, actually measuring the amount of virus when samples are taken from people who go into testing, CT values can be different across different regions, and at the threshold can be different in different regions. So someone who tests positive in one region may be a weak positive in the other region, or maybe even negative in another region. So that level of inconsistency is quite critical to decision making, because as we all know, that a one positive test or one negative test is actually making a huge difference at the policy level. And that's lack of information capturing, lack of standardization in information capturing, as well as setting those benchmarks, thresholds, and guidelines. That's one example. And also in the clinical observational studies, so the ICURs that are recorded, or the 24-hour window, it could start at different time points in different regions, which makes it challenging to compare information across different regions. And then you can't do a comparison if the definitions are not standard, if the thresholds are not standard, and they're not harmonized. Lack of pre-approved data collection and sharing protocols. So when I say pre-approved by bodies such as WHO, the jurisdictional governing bodies, and those data collection and sharing protocols should be pre-approved. The research value and the information gain should be clearly specified, and not during the pandemic, but before the pandemic starts. So we don't have those standardized pre-approved data collection and sharing protocols. The ethical and legal landscape is quite complex. And again, I try and keep those two things separate because they are. Just because collecting data from a certain setting is legal doesn't always make it ethical, if that makes sense. So just understanding where the ethical boundaries are and what the legal boundaries allow you to do or not allow you to do. And also the legal landscape in the context of a pandemic is also not very clear. And the RDA COVID-19 guidelines have captured that really well. But we do need sort of an emergency legislation, whether it's a jurisdiction level, whether it's from the regional level, or whether at a global level. What does the landscape tell us? What does the legal requirement, excuse me, what is the legal requirement to share data, not just data, but also specimens, because that has also been quite a challenging area of work. Data management practices, like I said, these challenges have been around for quite some time now. I mean, I haven't been around long, but I've spoken to people who have been around for decades, and they said not much has changed. 2009 pandemic happened, we were still grappling with the same issues. 2020 happened, we're still grappling with the same issues, but at different scales. Some things have changed, it's not all that bad, but still there are some issues that have just not changed. So it's a domain specific problem, and it takes time for things to change. And hopefully just the scale of this current pandemic gives me a bit of hope that things might change, but we'll see. Building capacity during preparedness phase, and probably I've spoken about this in so many different forums, that preparedness is the key, because we can actually start preparing now for the next pandemic and be much better prepared. So this is data management. So in terms of data analytics, and obviously data management feeds into analytics. So lack of harmonization and standardization then feeds into the lack of standardized analytical tools and protocols. Skills and infrastructure, there's obviously, we don't have, there's not an equal distribution of skills and infrastructure across the world. There are some regions who have more advantage in terms of skills and infrastructure, and they end up doing more analytics and producing more results and outputs. Bad quality data, it is a challenge, but I do feel that there's the balance between getting the data quickly and getting it in the perfect format, not just during a pandemic, but also during routine surveillance. So if I were to give an example of influenza here, influenza season lasts for a few months. And at that point, it's important to gather as much information as you can during that period and keep informing the public health activities, keep informing the regular reporting systems, and at the same time, prepare that information for vaccine design for the next year. That's how the whole influenza surveillance cycle works. Again, not an expert here in vaccine development, but just the cycle of information, that's how it works. Bespoke tools and software. So for analytics purposes, if the priority is to get the outputs out, if the priority is to get the results, and that leads to people developing bespoke tools and software, which will work for them, but then the whole reproducibility aspect is missing. And lack of collaborative platforms. So there are a bunch of platforms that are coming up now that would enable people to collaborate, but at the same time, this is not something that has happened before, where infectious diseases data was being fed into a national or an international collaborative platform. If I give an example of genomics is something that people are more comfortable with. People have done that before, and there's a certain level of threshold that needs to be met before your data is contributed to a global platform. And that is something people have been more comfortable with. They've done it, But in terms of epi data, we don't know what the threshold is. We don't know how much we can share and how much we shouldn't share, because differential privacy is a different concept as well. How much, in terms of regions, how many people there are, there's lots of sensitivities about sharing epidemiological data. So without epi data, we cannot look at a collaborative infectious diseases platform, analytics and management platform, data management platform. Again, capacity here is a big problem. So understanding that we need to build capacity for analytics during the preparedness phase and not when we're in the middle of a pandemic. So this is an ideal world. Again, I'm quite keen on hearing other people's thoughts here. So these are the four key topics that, not topics, but key features that have emerged out of not just the COVID-19 working group, but also a lot of conversations that I've had with people and what data specialists and data management specialists and data stewards feel like. So harmonization has come up so many times, and we do need a platform that has a quality check in place that only accepts data that's harmonized, and if not, has some sort of harmonization or integration engine built into the platform that helps with harmonization. And again, that is more of a group effort, of a community effort. People contributing data from different sources will need to help with that. It should be underpinned by FAIR principles. And that's needless to say. We want data assets to be findable. Otherwise, there's no way people will know where the information assets are sitting. And that's, again, metadata, making sure that the data assets have rich metadata, they're findable, and that actually keeps up with the ongoing research as well. So if I were to, again, give an example here, the symptoms that were with respect to COVID-19, the surveillance modules kept changing depending on the symptoms that the new symptoms that were recorded. So loss of taste, loss of smell. That's something that was discovered a bit later, and that information started getting recorded a bit later. But then that kept feeding into community participation, people who were giving their data, or people who were filling out survey forms and surveillance and other things. So that improves the findability, because we know that the respiratory diseases that is not COVID did not have this particular symptom, but this metadata that feeds into it, that we're recording different types of symptoms, and it's not the same as influenza, makes these data assets more findable, if that makes sense. And accessibility, we've talked about how the platform should be equitable. It should be accessible across different jurisdictions, across different settings, different sectors. Interoperability, again, harmonization, standardization would improve interoperability. It's a big aspect of having a unified platform. And reproducibility is very important from the preparedness perspective as well. Cross-jurisdictional, and not just cross-jurisdictional, but cross-sectoral as well. And I've mentioned this before, that infectious diseases is not just a health problem. It affects everything. When the communicable diseases start spreading, when there's an outbreak, when there's an epidemic, when there's a pandemic, it impacts all aspects of our lives. So it's important for the information silos to then connect to each other, whether it's social sciences, humanities, health. And ethically approved and fast-track, the protocol word is missing there, sorry, but I mean ethically approved and fast-track data collection and data management protocols. So with that, we have covered what the ecosystem looks like, a bit of a taster there. Natalie has covered what the RDA COVID-19 working group did, which was a massive community-led, community-driven effort to produce guidelines and recommendations on data sharing during this pandemic. I have talked a bit about infectious diseases and challenges associated with infectious diseases, which again feeds back into what we recorded in the COVID-19 working group, and what an ideal platform would look like. So in the workshop, we are not doing breakout rooms today because we don't have a lot of people, which is good. We can just stay here. We can all see each other and we can record people's responses. I'll be taking notes, and we can, because I've shared the collaborative notes file, we can all take some notes, and we can discuss what is infectious diseases data in your area of research. And you don't necessarily have to be from public health or infectious diseases data. Any kind of infectious disease data that you come in contact with or work with, or just if it's your interest area, we want to know that. any specific challenges that you have experienced or any of your colleagues have experienced, and you as a data specialist or someone who has interest in data is aware of that and want to highlight that. And the third thing that we want to cover is strategies. So ideas, solutions, shareable resources, anything from any other domain that we might be able to capture in infectious diseases and learn from that. All those thoughts are welcome. So I'm not sure what the best way to do this is. I can stop sharing my screen and I can post these points into the chat window, and then we can start the discussion. Mark, Natalie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think if you can even share your screen if you want, Priyanka, with the notes document. But as you suggested, I think there, with 18 of us, including the three facilitators, I think we probably would be just as well served with one breakout. And I thought maybe to get things started, what I can do is if people can keep this kind of initial remarks to 1 to 2 minutes and respond to any of those three questions, the data question, the challenge question, or the strategies question. And these are also repeated in the document. So I would suggest we can just keep notes in breakout session 1 in the notes document, Priyanka. So what I'm going to do is call on each person and just introduce yourself, your name and your role at your institution, and then just a couple of comments as you feel appropriate on either of those three. And then we'll come back and I'll probe in more detail on each of the additional ones, depending on what people's comments are. So feel free to introduce yourself and then make a comment on the data that's most common in your area, challenges that you've experienced in the context of data sharing, and strategies that you see facilitating this moving forward. So why don't we start with you, Rob?
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Rob Hoofd. I work for the Dutch Tech Center for Life Sciences in the Netherlands and Elixir in the Netherlands. Allow me to digress a little bit, or to retreat one step further than the three questions. And what we've been calling this in the RDA COVID-19 group, I think, is emergency response. And emergency response is, I think, one step broader than what we are pursuing here as a platform. And I think it is useful to place it in a context to see whether we actually need a platform for emergency response, or that, and I can imagine that from Priyanka's initiative, that we want it specifically for pandemics or for disease. In the three questions, the most important thing that came to my mind, so I'm not a practicing researcher. I am doing support for data management for a lot of people. What I saw is the word harmonization. And for me, harmonization is only the third step in solving the problem. So the first thing you want to have, if you have a well-prepared platform, is actually a good definition of what people are doing. So instead of just saying we measure the amount of deaths from COVID-19, you actually have to have a definition of when you see it is a death of COVID-19. Social media are full of people that are denying this by just saying, well, you know, it's a death with instead of a death of, and the other way around. So this is essential also for the before harmonization. And then when there are multiple ways of defining and you're still in a preparatory phase, then you can make choices and decide to do things one way in different countries. And only when that has failed, you need to go and harmonize data in the emergency response phase. I think that is important. So that was my first thing. The second that I want to do is only one sentence. I think under ethically approved, the data sovereignty is important to keep in mind. And with that, I'll give it over to the next person.
Okay, and I'm going to call each person just in the order I have them on my screen here. Andrew?
Hey everyone. I do not have any experience with infectious disease, but I'm interested in data repositories. I work for Figshare, which is a data repository platform. And I guess, I'm attending this session because I'm interested in how, I think it's definitely an emerging and big thing going on with COVID-19, of course. People are more aware of it. I'm interested in how current, existing repository structures help or don't help infectious disease data needs. So I'm looking to learn and kind of listen to what everybody's sharing, take some notes.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Claire? Claire, I don't know if you're speaking because you don't have the video on. Oh, there you go.
I had to had to look for my unmute button. Sorry. You hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a really good, a really good group. Very timely, as you all know, and intersects really very nicely with the new RDA. Oh, I keep forgetting the title. RDA common standard for surveillance data. We're calling it communicable disease, but infectious disease is essentially the same. And if I understand correctly, this interest group is focusing more on the platform aspect of FAIR infectious disease data. And we had a meeting last week, and we were discussing that even with the best, most comprehensive standard and wide adoption, it's not going to be successful without also building a platform. So this works out really very well, I think. It's huge. Both the work is enormous to develop a common standard, a common data standard for reporting surveillance data, and also huge for when we're talking about a platform. So one of the important things to do, I think, straight off the bat, is to try and zero in on exactly what we want to do and achieve, what our objectives are, and how they relate and intersect with each other. We're also talking about how this situates very nicely with the CODATA decadal program, and putting it in that context also. Sorry, okay. I think I went over the 2 minutes, so I'll stop.
That's okay. I mean, the advantage to a small group is everybody has a few words. So if we can keep them brief, and that was brief.
You wanted me to say who? So I work for the Government of Canada, the Department of the Environment, and I co-chaired the epidemiology subwork group for the RDA COVID-19, and I'm also leading this new work group for a common data standard. And I'm not an infectious disease expert, but my PhD is from the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health at McGill.
All right, thanks, Claire. Brian?
Hi there, my name is Brian Corey. I'm from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I'm involved in an immune genetics project, and we've been working on curating COVID-19 data. So I'm very interested in this space. I think my main comment is that I think sharing one type or class of data. So we work with data that is around genomics of the immune response. Even that is challenging enough, and it's just one type of data. And I think going beyond that, I think, is very challenging, even for the researchers to be able to take advantage of, even if it's a chicken and egg thing. I think we have even if we could provide a platform that would do it, I think because researchers haven't been able to do it before, it's still very, very challenging for people to wrap their head around what they could do with it if they had such a platform. So I think that's one of the big challenges, I think.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And I should highlight, I would think of platform, and I don't know what Priyanka's original intention was in using the term platform, but RDA frequently uses the term platform to refer to the social as well as computer and other mechanisms that RDA uses to bring people together to discuss common problems. So, and I know many of us, Brian, and myself in particular, and I'm sure others, are used to thinking of a platform as a particular software platform. But I think if we try to think of it as that former one, community of like-minded folks with a common interest, that might help our subsequent conversation. And if I don't pronounce your name properly, I apologize. Hajin? Sorry, you're muted. There you go.
Sorry. All right, my name is Huajing Wang. I'm a librarian at Carnegie Mellon University Libraries and also program director for open science and data collaborations. My PhD training was actually not related to like libraries at all. I was a cell biologist by training, and I worked a lot with the imaging data and omics types of data. So my interest is primarily on the data reuse, how to make data more reusable. So a lot of effort recently, I organized a conference called AI for Data Discovery and Reuse. So a lot of researchers come and present their in multiple disciplines, how they share data, and using AI try to make the data, for example, extract metadata, make the data somehow more reusable. But often the conversation landed on, it's a feed forward loop, right? So first you need to make the metadata better and machine readable and human readable before the AI can do anything. And then you use AI to sort of refine the data and make the data better. So I'm very interested in this type of work in this space, just how to maybe by along the lines of metadata and data harmonization, just make the data more reusable. And as for infectious diseases, I just think it's a very timely topic. So I'm really interested.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. Dimitri?
Hi. Thanks for letting me in this group. Is my first RDA, so I thought I just peacefully connect and learn, but I realized that this is the round of introduction, so I do mine very quickly. I'm a scientific officer in GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and I heard from many of my colleagues that RDA is a really cool series of open data and in data infrastructure events, so it took me a while to register, but here I am. So I'm interested in the topic of today for three reasons. A couple of years ago, I initiated a program of open data advocacy for biodiversity. It's called Biodiversity Open Data Ambassadors. I know RDA has own ambassadors, so this is like an unfortunate terminological overlap. But the mission is that we have very advanced speakers who can basically convince hesitating or skeptical researchers into the open data mindset. And so they start sharing their data. In that context, we started a task group on mobilization of data on vectors, hosts, and reservoirs, or wild species that could carry human disease pathogens. And so we are just starting, and we managed to collect a group of experts who will be thinking what's the order of disease, what's the priority. And I can just tell you that COVID and sort of hot topic reactions, it's carried out by so many other groups, by CTAF, by CoData, and so on and so on. So I think it will be longer term, more peaceful, but nevertheless important endeavor. So we'll see more of mosquito, tick, mollusk, bat and sandfly and so on data out in the open data landscape using the existing standards and the existing platforms. So I'm a content enthusiast. I think invention and connecting is very important, but we should do so much with the things we have already now. So
Great.
this is what I'm coordinating. Thank you.
And that kind of your last remarks describe RDA quite well. Crystal?
Hi, I'm Crystal. I'm a research data specialist from the University of Melbourne here in Australia. And much like Andrew, I sort of don't know a lot about the topic, sort of here for to get an overview and some background. And obviously because you know, the work is so timely and so important. So I probably don't have a lot to contribute in terms of the questions posed in the chat. But yeah, very, very much here for, yeah, that kind of general interest at this point, yeah.
Well, and I appreciate Crystal and Priyanka, and I think Andrew and maybe one or two others joining us at a crazy hour in Australia in that time zone. So thanks for that. Alex?
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's just gone 5 in Melbourne. Like Priyanka and Crystal, I work at the Melbourne Data Analytics Platform as an academic specialist. So this is somewhat beyond my area of specialty, but I'm very interested in learning more about how the FAIR principles can be applied to infectious disease data. So here to learn from you all, and yeah, thanks. Thank you.
And our last one, because I see we had a couple people log out. Mervyn? Not sure if I pronounced your name correctly. You're muted in case you are speaking. Okay. So maybe, Mervyn, if you are able to enable your audio, then just interrupt me if you have something you want to add. So I think the good thing about the conversation we just had is it does illustrate the range of interests and experiences and perspectives in this ecosystem, and that kind of brings us around to the kind of one of the reasons for calling this group together is to try and figure out how to provide that platform context to move the conversation forward, that context being infectious disease and the priorities that Priyanka had highlighted. So before I kind of move us forward to talk a little bit about how RDA works and what it might mean to kind of, in terms of next step, which we definitely want to talk about before the session ends. Does anybody have any other particular comments to add in terms of the types of data in your network, specific challenges that aren't listed in the notes that were taken here, or strategies on how to facilitate data sharing in the context? So any other kind of general remarks in the context of those 3 questions?
It's Claire here. You mentioned genomics. I'm wondering to what extent you think that the genomics platforms that have been developed could be a model to work from.
Okay, so genomics as a model, genomics platforms. And Priyanka highlighted, I forgot to introduce myself, just to give my own context. So I'm the Executive Director for Research Data Canada and also co-chair with my colleague Ingrid Dillo from the Netherlands for RDA's Council, which is kind of the overall governing body for RDA. I also chair the CodeData's International Data Policy Committee, and I'm co-chair for a few RDA groups. So my interest is pretty broad, typically high level, but I guess you could say my primary day job is to bring people together, to create connections, to facilitate solutions and outcomes in terms of best practices for data management, which is part of the reason why this one is of such interest to me. And also the fact that I did work with Priyanka and Natalie and others, including Claire and Rob, on the RDA COVID-19 data sharing guidelines. So feel free to put a physical hand up or a virtual hand up if you want to interrupt me at any point here, but I'm going to cruise down in our notes to page 6, which is where there is a table that describes the differences between the different types of groups in the RDA context. And I did want to focus in on this one just for a few minutes because I think it comes back to Priyanka's earlier comments about a platform, as well as some other comments, and we'll give especially the newcomers a sense of how RDA works. So the work that Natalie described in terms of the COVID-19 group, that is what RDA traditionally calls a working group. The big difference between that working group and a typical working group is that the COVID-19 group was pulled together and created an output in the course of basically 2 months. 2 to 3 months. Normally, a working group has 12 to 18 months to meet and ruminate and discuss and produce an output. So that just to kind of highlight that as somewhat a bit of an outlier in terms of how RDA would normally work in terms of timelines. So having said that, working from the right-hand column in this table over, the way RDA typically works is a group expresses an interest in gathering and discussing common interests and potentially or typically at some point producing an output. So this session is a birds of a feather session, and that's often how other types of groups in RDA are created and started. The other one is the working group, which is the one I described with the COVID-19 work. Any one of these 3 or 4 types of groups can happen kind of organically and come from conversations of the stakeholder community. So there's no kind of linear progression from a birds of a feather to an interest group or working group, etc. But this table just kind of gives you a sense of the differences. So working groups typically have a 12 to 18 month timeline. And at the end of that timeline, they produce an output, which could be a white paper or sample code or an actual platform, as in a traditional software platform kind of context. An interest group, and when that working group has completed their effort, then they typically either disband or they redefine themselves to kind of carry on with another 12 to 18 month life cycle of effort. And they may well also keep themselves around and live in order to maintain an output if it's the kind of output that requires updating and maintenance. An interest group is exactly what you would think. It's a group of like-minded people that gather, discuss things. There's no timeline as to when an interest group starts or ends. And it simply reflects, again, a group of like-minded individuals who come together. The fourth one, which is communities of practice, is a brand new concept in the RDA community. And it's again it's a goal. The goal is to kind of grow on the BoF interest group, working group kind of efforts to largely reflect a domain specific interest. So a community of practice, like an interest group, is a group of people who share a concern or passion for something they do and want to learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. The big difference is communities of practice and umbrella groups are bringing together people who are coordinating who potentially can coordinate the work of other interest groups and working groups in a specific domain or discipline or context. And that coordinating interaction of that domain or discipline specific context is the critical aspect of a community of practice. And each community of practice, once it gets underway, will typically have one or more interest groups and or working groups that kind of function within that community of practice or are the target, if you will, of the facilitating, coordinating effort of that community of practice. One of the big challenges in RDA, especially for folks that are new, is there are over 100 working groups and interest groups. And we don't even count birds of a feather in that 100. So typically at any given plenary, there might be 120-ish of these different groups. So one of the challenges is how do you, from a discipline-specific context, derive the value or understand even the value that can be pulled from any of those 100+ interest groups and working groups. So as the COVID-19 effort got underway, it kind of galvanized the thinking that the RDA team had been undertaking in the last little while. And that was exemplified by one of the very early communities in RDA's lifespan, and that is the agriculture interest group. It's called IGAD, or the Interest Group for Agricultural Data. So that group has been around since the beginning, and it's one of the very few kind of disciplinary groups that RDA has stewarded over the years. And it's a kind of an exemplary example of a community of practice before we had that designation, because in that IGAD context, there are a number of other interest groups and working groups that work together and are coordinated by that kind of higher level agricultural data interest group. So one of the thoughts we had, and when I was speaking with Priyanka, as she mentioned, when she had proposed a BoF on infectious disease for Melbourne, was that it might lend itself very naturally to the opposite side of creating a community of practice than what we saw with the agriculture group, which was a mature group that helped form the framework that we call the community of practice framework. In this case, we would have a brand new group that would use that still currently draft governance document and framework for defining a community of practice and build one from scratch. So that's one of the thoughts that we have. Other people on the call, Claire, for example, has mentioned that there's another epidemiology working group that's kind of moving ahead in the current plenary context, and again, coming from that COVID-19 working group effort. So that's kind of the background that I wanted to provide in terms of how RDA works and introduce this idea of communities of practice to this group, so we can have an open discussion about the potential interest or value in that option, or do we see starting with an interest group or a working group, or continuing the conversation in some other context. So that's the background piece. So I'll just kind of open it up. I don't know if Natalie or Priyanka had any other comments. Otherwise, we'll just open it up in general to get people's thoughts on how you think we might proceed in terms of next steps and specific strategies for moving the communicated interest forward.
I mean, I would, maybe Priyanka, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's your idea. So would you speak, because Mark mentioned that he differentiated ideas of what a platform is, you know, and speaking about platform as a social platform as well. So would you speak more to what a little bit more about the idea of the platform? Because that seemed to be the core thing that differentiated this group in some ways from approaching similar topics, but you know, with different goals in mind.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Natalie. That's true. So as Mark said, that there's two definitions of platform here, basically. So there's the social infrastructure and a framework that supports the management of data and the analytics of data. And then there's the technical infrastructure. I think what I'm looking at is both, a bit of both. So a community-driven effort to create the social infrastructure, because I feel like the technological infrastructure is the easier part here. That's an easier problem to solve. But the social infrastructure, the sort of community-driven efforts that's required, that is more important than the technical one. Because once we have the social infrastructure in place, once we have the harmonization in place, once we have a robust idea of what the platform would look like, and consensus actually more than anything else, and drawing the value out of the platform, I think then getting the infrastructure bit is the easier part. And like I said, the data management issues, once they are resolved, I think the analytics then becomes easy.
Yeah, and there certainly are examples of, the one that comes to mind is the FAIR, what's now known as FAIR sharing, which started as a bio-sharing group. And their goal was to discuss the various kind of requirements for FAIR infrastructure and the minimal kind of standards and best practices that would be associated with attaching the name of a FAIR compliant, or the name phrase FAIR compliant, to an existing piece of infrastructure. So they started with the kind of the general conversation and then evolved into actually producing a pilot software platform, which then became what we now know as FAIR sharing, which is a well-maintained and important software platform in the community. So I think it can, as Priyanka suggests, it can certainly evolve, or it can certainly move forward as BoF. You know, having the social piece to bring all the thoughts and ideas together on how you might, for example, have a best practices platform that demonstrates how you support all of these things, I think is a good example of how something like this could evolve.
Mark, do you think this is something that can start off as a community of practice, then form into a working group, and then feed into the sort of technical infrastructure or technical definitions and standards?
Oh, for sure. One of the conversations that the council and the other RDA governing bodies are having around a community of practice is, does it derive from an existing group, like a working group or interest group, or can it start from scratch? So to my mind, even though it wasn't the original intention, Priyanka, as you highlighted in your remarks, the COVID-19 working group does provide a convenient opportunity from which to spawn a community of practice. So moving from that specific lens of COVID-19 to the broader set of lenses for infectious disease, I think we could still think of a community of practice in this context as stemming from that original COVID-19 working group effort. In which case we create a community of practice, and then that community of practice can spin off interest groups. They can coordinate or work with existing interest groups. They can spin off or coordinate efforts with working groups. So it's the thing we're looking for in RDA in terms of communities of practice is how do we make the efforts of RDA in a disciplinary context more meaningful and produce the kinds of outputs that a community of practice is interested in, given the complexities of, you know, the traditional set of interest groups and working groups and all the other things that RDA does.
So is it safe to assume that we can see community of practice as a broad umbrella, and then under this umbrella, there's different pathways that can operate? So even for infectious diseases, say, for example, Claire mentioned genomics, right? So how genomics can actually act as, and Rob is better placed to respond to this, how genomics can actually be seen as a learning example because of how mature the data sharing practices are. So that forms a component of the community of practice because the metadata and standards are more mature. But then there's another aspect like epidemiology where there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So then that forms a different pathway. Absolutely. So the community practice becomes a broad umbrella term or a framework under which different pathways can operate.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you look, I mean, both communities, some people have said, what's the difference between a community of practice and an interest group? And the simple response is the community of practice is intended to be kind of anchored in a discipline or a particular domain context, whereas an interest group is just that. It doesn't typically address a particular discipline or domain of practice. So RDA has traditionally strayed away from having all of these various disciplinary efforts evolve. So community of practice is a way to do that and have it go through the normal RDA processes in order to come up with the outputs that the group is interested in.
One of the things I was going to ask a question about was the scope of kind of what you're talking about, because I think you just mentioned a couple of interesting things because they are in some ways quite different. The epidemiology side of infectious disease is very different than the biological side of infectious disease. And do you see this covering both of those or one of those? And I think, Mark, you mentioned the epidemiology interest group or something else is forming somewhere else in the RDA as another group. Yeah. So how do those tie together? So that was one of the interesting things that for me, I'm coming from the biological side. And as I mentioned, even the biological side of sharing immunology data with the actual comparing that to the genome of how the virus is changing is just challenging on the biology side, just in and of itself.
Yeah. I mean, to use the agriculture data group as an example, they will often have a 1 or 2 day pre-RDA workshop because it allows them to focus in on that interest in agricultural data. And they may have concurrent or, other ways of approaching their schedule, but, there's the wheat interoperability group and the rice interoperability group that's looking at metadata standards for describing research on wheat and rice. And then there's other higher level groups that are looking at particular types of standards or best practices that are of particular interest in the agricultural context. So I think it would be, to my mind, the community of practice provides a best case scenario where a group of individuals from all the perspectives, biological, epidemiological, clinical, as we saw with COVID-19, legal and ethical, can consider the broad umbrella of infectious disease, like we did for the COVID-19 exercise, both in those kind of safe zones where people are talking the same language and same interests and metadata standards for data repositories, but at the same time, they're able to bring that up in a more efficient and effective mechanism to a broader conversation about an infectious disease writ large. So having a community of practice for something as broad as infectious disease doesn't limit the opportunity to have a specific working group that is focused solely on immunological data, for example. But again, I think the conversation is happening in the context of a higher level coordination, which I think is the part that in particular interests us. Claire, I think you were going to say something.
Yes, sorry, I'm just chatting with Rajini, my co-chair, on the new EPI group. The new EPI common standard for reporting surveillance data work group is not yet endorsed, but we do have a draft case statement, which is presently in community review. We're working on a new version, an updated version of it, but I put in the chat there a link to the work group on the RDA page. And if you scroll down, you'll find the link to the case statement. And I would very much welcome people's comments on the case statement. And that might be the opportunity also for people to identify where this group, whether it becomes an interest group or a community of practice or another working group, where the intersection lies. There may be, we might also want to think about whether or not with the new EPI common data standard working group, if we want to create subgroups that would focus on particular aspects that may be highlighted in this discussion here. I think that I don't see overlap. No, I don't see that the two groups, or the way it's been articulated so far, that we are duplicating effort. But I do see the need to keep our activities very closely aligned. The thing about a working group is that once you create a working group, and then your case statement goes out for public review, and then is reviewed by TAB, and the work group is endorsed. Well, then the clock starts ticking. Now you have 18 months to come up with a deliverable. So it's really important to plan carefully exactly what that deliverable is going to be.
So just maybe taking that as a segue to our last few minutes, because we're 5 minutes before the half hour and the end of the session. One of the takeaways I wanted to make sure we had was if there are any people on the call who might be interested in engaging in a conversation about drafting up a charter for, let's assume, a community of practice, and then it will evolve either in that direction or into an interest group context from there. So I did want to make sure that people had an opportunity to indicate whether they would like to continue to be involved in moving forward from Priyanka's idea for a birds of a feather, to see if there's interest in continuing the conversation and getting involved in an effort to describe what a community of practice for infectious disease might look like. Priyanka, were you going to say something?
I'm quite keen to put together a charter. I think if that helps move the discussion forward, if we don't get, if people are not sure yet what exactly the platform would look like. So defining the goal and objectives and what the aim is, and how the community of practice as an umbrella or a framework would enable other forms of outputs and enable other forms of work and pathways. Yeah. I can put together that charter if that helps people decide, and distribute it on the collaborative notes, and then send it through to the attendees of this workshop.
Okay. So Priyanka's offering to pull together a charter, and I'll, as somebody on council who's been working on the framework for communities of practice, I'll work with Priyanka to help pull that together. And I see Alex has indicated a thumbs up. So we will let everybody know as that moves forward, because we have your contact info. Is there anybody again on the call who would be interested in working up front with Priyanka and myself on pulling together a community of practice? Just to make sure everybody has an opportunity to learn more about how that stuff works. Okay.
I'm very interested in the project. But it's my second time working with, like, joining the RDA meeting, so I'm not so sure how to. But I would be happy to help. Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Hwajin. And I would say that the best way as a newcomer or somebody who hasn't been to a lot of RDAs to get involved and understand how it works is to get involved in something like this. So I think what we'll do then is I'll just take the three of us and take that opportunity to get it, once I get a signal from Priyanka that she's, her schedule allows her to kind of think about this. Once this RDA week is done, then I'll reach out to Priyanka and Hwajin just to arrange for an initial call. And then what will come from that group of three exercise is a draft charter that will go to this entire group to get feedback, and almost probably have a subsequent call to discuss the details and how we move that forward. And then what I will do on the other side of that is I will inform RDA Council that there's an interest emerging in defining a community of practice around infectious disease, so that they're aware that this is moving ahead. So just, I'll make sure we cover off the work of this group as well as behind the scenes to alert council that this kind of action will be coming.
Mark, it's Claire.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps include me on that group of 3, make it a group of 4 to just so we can coordinate with the EPI working group and, you know, keep it aligned from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I will do that, Claire. And Rob, your suggestion is, I think, is tying this into the larger COVID-19 working group discussion. Yeah. So Rob's referring to the COVID-19 working group session, which is taking place tomorrow. So I'll be having inserting this into that conversation because I'm working with a couple of colleagues and co-chairing that session tomorrow. So we'll bring that to the conversation because one of the core takeaways from that COVID-19 working group session is how does this work continue? So it will either continue along the lines of what Claire has highlighted, or it will kind of evolve into or part of this community of practice context, or it will be something different. So it's all,
I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments?
Can I ask a beginner's question?
Mm-hmm.
I've seen many task groups and working groups in TADWIG and in GBIF and so on. And I think when it comes to open data and the kind of thinking together about the best ways, the activities basically fall into 2 categories. Some are about the better processes, like discussing better standards, better platforms, system-to-system solutions. And I sense that this is closer to what RDA typically does. Again, this is my first time, so sorry if I'm asking something very stupid. And the other activities, they are more kind of, they are driven by particular needs and data hungers, data gaps, and so they are more content oriented. So they're more like utilizing whatever data solutions we have at hand, and then let's get the content out for the particular need. So they're not driven by the data opportunities. We have the data, let's make it open, but they are driven by a data hunger. So they satisfy the particular need. And I'm a little bit lost. What is the mission of the group you're forming now? Could you please say a few words about that?
Well, I think it can potentially serve both contexts. If I understand you correctly, Dimitri, you're in the GBIF and TADWIG context, which I've participated in as well. It's a very focused conversation around particular existing, or if necessary, the need for new standards and best practices. So RDA conversations can also go in that direction, typically in the context of a working group, as Claire highlighted, where you have a specific need that's driving a requirement for an output that will help drive best practices in the community. And then there's that overall broader social platform context of facilitating the conversation, coordinating the conversation, making sure the links between the different disciplinary communities are maintained, known. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think to my mind, the simple answer is it can evolve into both.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Priyanka, I'm going to leave it to you because it probably went on a little long there. So I'm going to leave it to you or Natalie for final comments.
I'll keep it short. I think even with a smaller group, I feel like we achieved quite a bit in 90 minutes and we're looking at a way forward. And I'm very keen to engage with this group again once the draft charter is put together. And also get in touch with people who've expressed interest to be involved and then see where this goes. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your valuable inputs. This has been really good.
Natalie?
No, I have nothing to add. That was perfectly well said. Thank you for this. Okay,
so we'll be in touch with the larger group, but I'll also be in touch with Huajin, Claire, and Priyanka once Priyanka and I have a chance to get through the RDA week, and we'll set up a call to talk about the charter context in more detail. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent
Thanks.
meeting. Thanks.
Bye.